Well, as always, I hope that you're doing well. I hope your week has been good to you so far. I hope you're not sick, but I know of a lot of people that are sick and they are in need of our prayers, and we certainly want to be lifting their names up before our Father as much as we possibly can, asking Him to bless their well being and to give them good days. Um, let me finish that thought like we do normally. If you are sick or hurting in any way and we don't know about it, we want to know about it because we want to be praying for you. We want to let you know that we love you. And if we can do anything at all for you, we just ask that you would ask us. Now, what I was going to say before that, we are still in the book of Genesis and we are nearing the end. Of the life of Abraham. We're not going to quite finish that tonight, but we're almost there. So new things are ahead of us, but we are in Genesis chapter 22 tonight. So if you have your Bibles, Genesis 22, maybe we'll get to Genesis 23. I hope so, but probably not if I had to guess. This is what is said. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Now, notice from the very beginning of chapter 22, we are told that God is going to, he's planning to put Abraham to the supreme test, right? Now, the narrator departs from the usual style. Because he directly tells us. You might remember when the angels came to Abraham when he was in his tent. Abraham didn't know from the very beginning. We recognized that these are heavenly visitors. These aren't ordinary men. But Abraham slowly became aware that these were not just ordinary men. The narrator writes the story in such a way where we can become aware of that. I'm doing a terrible job explaining this. We're aware of it because we have the blessing of knowing the story. Abraham was not aware of it, and the narrator goes through great lengths to show us that he slowly becomes aware, more and more aware of it as the story unfolds. Okay, still did a terrible job explaining that, but we're going to move on. Well, instead here of letting us figure out what is actually happening and what God is actually asking of Abraham, the narrator just tells us directly God is about to put Abraham through a great test. Now, just as we have the blessing of knowing how every story ends, we know that Abraham is being tested because the narrator tells us that. Abraham does not know that this is just a test. Now, we might see throughout reading the Old Testament, especially the Pentateuch, that God tests Israel a number of times. Right? When they cross the Red Sea, God lets them go several days without water and the people start to complain. Well, why is he letting them go without water? Well, it seems that he's testing them. Or, God says, I'm going to allow manna to fall from heaven and they're only to go out and collect a daily portion. Why just a daily portion? God is testing them. This is not only just to see, for God to see their true character. Now, we might want to stop here because that we ought to draw put a question mark by that in our minds, right? Why does God need to see their true character? I thought God knows all things. Well, we have seen time and time again throughout the Old Testament, because God is all powerful, that gives him the ability to know all things. But because he's all powerful, he can choose to know all things, or he can choose not to know some things, right? He can know as much as he wants to, and he can forget as much as he wants to. So sometimes he does want to see the true character of different people, but also in testing people, God is allowing these people to develop several qualities that are very pleasing in the eye of God. Now notice when God calls Abraham, he only calls his name once. Now usually when God calls a person's name, not usually, but sometimes that person's name is repeated. But Abraham's name is only called once by God. This is to show us, I think, how close of a relationship Abraham actually had with God. Notice Abraham's response. He responds right off, "Here I am. I'm willing to do, in essence, whatever it is that you are about to ask of me." So Abraham, as we've seen time and time again, is lovingly obedient to God. But then we get to verse 2. He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Well, okay, this is where things get really real, aren't they? Because he says, notice the different commands that he gives. He says, take, first of all, there's 3 commands. Take your only son Isaac. Now, notice that Isaac is further described. Your only son, whom you love, right? Abraham is not to confuse what it is that God is actually asking him to do, or whom it is that God is actually asking him to sacrifice. You know, we're aware in chapter 15 that perhaps Abraham and Sarah had an adopted son that was in charge of that was responsible for taking care of them in their old age and ensuring that they were buried and maybe coming and visiting them after they died because they didn't have an heir. Right, well then Ishmael came along and Abraham said, well now Ishmael's my heir because he's my son through Hagar. Well then the son of promise actually shows up and now he's the heir of all things. Well, God says, the one I want you to sacrifice, it's not it's not the guy we talked about in chapter 15. It's not Ishmael, the son of Hagar. This is the son of promise. So he says, take Isaac, your son, and then the next command, go to the region of Moriah. Now notice that God doesn't give him a specific location. He only gives him a general location. This indirectly tells us that God is going to give him further instructions on what he is to do. But this is the same verb that's used when God tells him to leave his father's household, right? And remember how Abraham responded. He quickly obeyed God, and he's going to do that again. Well, then he tells him, and of course this is the climax of the test, right? Sacrifice your son. Abraham should have no question as to what the fate of Isaac would be if this is to take place, right? He's to offer him as a burnt offering. We know from the book of Leviticus that burnt offerings are consumed by fire, so Isaac was going to die if this was going to take place. But notice that Abraham gets right to it, because in verse 3 we see Abraham rose early in the morning. He doesn't waste any time in obeying the will of God. Now, Abraham at times, and we've seen throughout Genesis, will debate sort of with God. He'll go back and forth with him. He understood that this was not something that was up for debate. He got busy with it, but the text also hints at the heaviness of Abraham's heart. We might think just because he really got busy in obeying his command that Abraham was just sort of heartless and this command wasn't tearing him apart. Well, no, the text tells us in an indirect way that he had a very heavy heart. So Abraham rose in the morning, and notice what he does first. He saddles his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose, and he went to the place of which God had told him. Notice that he does first what one would typically expect one to do last in preparing a journey. one doesn't prepare the donkeys first. That's usually what one does last. They get everything together, then they pack the donkeys, and then they travel on their way. And notice, Abraham knows that he's taking Isaac, but he doesn't tell Isaac until after he tells his servants. But then notice as well, the last thing that Abraham does is he cuts the wood, right? He doesn't want this to become a reality. He's sort of trying to delay this as much as he possibly can. But notice, it would be the job of the servant to cut the wood, but Abraham does it himself. Why? He wants to identify with the sacrifice of Isaac. He is saying, I'm going to use my own energy. I want to be a part of this sacrifice because God has demanded it of me. So nevertheless, Abraham has a heavy heart, but he's able, his resolve, I guess we could say, is able to overcome his resistance. But then we get to verses 4 and 5. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar off. So the text goes out of its way to tell us it's on the third day. And as we can sort of imagine, Abraham probably didn't travel at the fastest pace. He probably sought to delay this as much as he could, so he took his time, cherishing the time that he had left with his son Isaac. But it's on this third day that he lifts up his eyes and he sees the place from afar off. Well, then we get the detail in verse 5. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." So I sort of wonder, was this journey silent? Sort of a solemn journey. I'm not sure that much conversation took place on this journey. Who knows? All we know from verse 5 is that Abraham feels the need to fill in his servants with the rest of the details, and he has no desire that they come with him. So Abraham tells them, myself and the boy, we're going to go over there and we are going to worship. Now that's a pretty interesting detail in the text, but the word that he uses for worship is pretty obscure. The servants would not have been able to recognize what it is that Abraham and Isaac were actually going to do. Abraham doesn't want to fill them in on the details that are about to take place. All they need to know is they will be back. And of course, we start to see that Abraham has some hope that things aren't going to play out the way that perhaps he was led to think that things that were going to take place. Well, verses 6 through 8, and I know I'm talking very quickly. I'm trying to get through this. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. This is probably sort of symbolic. That was sort of intentional, right? That he lays the wood on Isaac. He's identifying Isaac as the sacrifice. So he lays the wood on Isaac, and he took in his hand the knife and the fire. So they went, both of them, together. So Abraham gathers the lethal materials himself, and they go. Now we get from the details of the text, we get the impression that Abraham sought to delay the sacrifice once again. Why? How do we know that? That's what I wanted to ask, not why, but how do we know that? Well, notice he dismounts from the donkeys. He doesn't take his donkey and Isaac's donkey with them. They depart on foot for the rest of the journey. Well, then we get to verse 7, and Isaac said to his father, Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering?" Isaac is starting to realize that something is up, something is not right. So he has some questions, and Abraham kind of sees his son probably is becoming a bit apprehensive at this point. Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went, both of them, together. Well, again, we're starting to see that Abraham has hope here, right? He does not want to think that what has been told to him is actually going to become a reality. He's going to obey God, but he sort of holds on to the idea that God will reward him because of his obedience. So we get to verse 9. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. So Abraham builds an altar. This wouldn't have been something that he would have had to figure out to do, how to do. We've seen that Abraham has built plenty of altars as he's went throughout the land of Canaan. So he builds the altar. Notice the 4 verbs. He builds, he arranges, he binds Isaac, and he lays him. Abraham went about this in a systematic way. There's little indication in the text that a conversation actually took place between Abraham and Isaac at this point, but nevertheless, he is going to sacrifice his son. Then Abraham reached out his hand. This is the climactic point of the story, right? And took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. Now, notice when God is wanting to speak to Abraham at the beginning of the story, he only uses his name once. The angel of the Lord, however, calls from heaven. Now, the text gives us that detail that the angel of the Lord is speaking from heaven, because sometimes the angel of the Lord finds his place on earth, but nevertheless, he's in heaven. And Abraham is always willing to accept the heavenly call. So Abraham answers, Here I am. But the angel of the Lord said his name twice. Why? Because it is urgent that Abraham stops what he's doing, right? His hope is about to become realized. He is not going to have to offer his son Isaac, but the angel needs him to put down the knife and not go through with what the Lord has asked him to do. So, God put Abraham up to a very difficult test, and Abraham was found genuine, and as a result, God is going to reward him. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by his horns, and Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Now, let's finish that. So Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be called provided. Now this is significant, because what does Abraham tell the servants? Abraham tells the servants that he and the boy are going to go yonder and they're going to worship. Abraham had every intention to worship God, regardless of how that was going to take place, whether that was going to take place by the sacrificing of Isaac, his son, or the sacrificing of some other animal. Abraham is able to fulfill what he intended to do. But notice that Abraham names the place, The Lord will provide. Abraham is fully confident that God will provide. He will meet the needs of those that trust in him. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now notice that God repeats the promise that he has given to Abraham several times now, but he strengthens the promise here, and he sort of does this in 4 ways. Notice that God says, I swear by myself. This is the highest oath, right? Because the Lord can do nothing else than be true to himself. In other words, Abraham, you ought to have full assurance that what I'm about to tell you is absolutely, positively going to take place. This is an unconditional promise, right? I'm going to do what I said I'm going to do. But then notice as well the phrase declares the Lord. This is usually a phrase that we find throughout in the book of the prophets. But this is a phrase that's only found one time here in the book of Genesis. I think that's significant. But then number 3, God affirmed that He would bless Abraham unconditionally. That is the strongest way in which the promise has been stated, and we've already said that. I kind of gave that away in the first one. But then lastly, this is the first time that His promised offspring is compared to the sand of the seashore. So God also promises. And I know I'm going quickly, and I'm basically having to read my notes now because I want to get done with this and then stop at verse 20. But God promises that His offspring would gain control of their enemies' strongholds, so nobody is going to defeat them, right? His people, His offspring, are going to be successful in defeating their enemies. I knew we had to blow through that last part. I'm sorry for that, but we need to get through this. So I'm going to stop there. We'll pick up in verse 20 next week. God bless.